And then I'm going to share.
And then let's make a little, see how I can make the box really small? We don't have to look at it. Like, no. Less.
Oh,
Yeah, hide. Yeah, perfect.
perfect.
All right. Okay, thank you. Okay. All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome back for day 2. We have a couple of quick announcements before we start. So first, Araceli, despite being under the weather, has emailed each person who did not do their pre-survey. So, and CC'd me, so I know who you are. And so if you haven't had a chance to do that, it would be really wonderful if you could please still do that. It does not take long at all. And then also yesterday, she also sent out a end of day survey. And it says it takes 10 minutes. It literally takes 1 minute. So if you haven't, that's a typo, and none of them will take 10 minutes. They will all take 1 minute. So you'll get another one today. It's just 1 minute. And so please go ahead and do that. If you haven't already done it, you could literally click it right now and you'll be done before Alex's presentation starts. So please do that. It's really important information for us to have. So with that in mind, I'm going to get us started and introduce our next speakers. So today, our next presentation is, the presenter is Dr. Alex Dopp, and the work is co-created by Dr. Dopp as well as Trisha Ong, Dr. Trisha Ong. So I just want to acknowledge both speakers. So Dr. Ong is a PhD candidate at the University of Washington Human-Centered Design and Engineering program. She has over 10 years of professional experience working in public health and human-centered design. She designs and leads qualitative and quantitative public health research and supports evaluations of maternal, newborn, child health, and nutrition programs at scale. So we really appreciate her contributions to this work, as well as Dr. Dopp's. So Dr. Dopp is a behavioral scientist and social scientist at RAND and a policy analysis professor at Pardee RAND Graduate School. His work focuses on improving youth mental health and substance use services through research, evidence, and policy, with expertise in behavioral health services and economic evaluation as well. He studies financing strategies and economic impacts of treatments. And I also want to say, as I was early in my exposure to implementation science, Dr. Dopp was very involved in the dissemination and implementation science SIG at ABCT, and I learned a lot just like from hearing him even as a discussant. So we're really excited to have him here with us today, and looking forward to learning more about his work, which is focused on human-centered design for equity-focused implementation, research, and strategy development. So welcome and thank you.
All right, let me get this in full screen. Good morning, everybody. I hope you had a good first day yesterday and a good first night last night. And nice to see you all here. You might have noticed from the introduction that I do not have a background in design. I wish that Trisha had been able to come and actually co-present with me. But I'm more of a fanboy, and so is there anybody in the room, just out of curiosity, who has any sort of background in design? Okay, well, good. Then I'm probably the right person to present to this audience anyways. But I just wanted to get that out of the way is, I'm going to try to introduce you to some methods and some ways of thinking. But don't go into this thinking that, oh, by the end of this, I should be able to use these methods on my own independently. That's not my goal, and that's probably not realistic. So if you go in thinking about it that way, you might feel really overwhelmed during this presentation, and I don't want to do that to you. My hope is that by the end, you might start thinking about, I'm really excited to learn more about these methods. How could I find the designers at my institution? How could I find the designers in my community? How could I find my Trisha or whoever else who I could collaborate with? Because my experience is that people who have a design background have a completely different way of viewing the world and conceptualizing problems and solutions. And it's really nice and it's really refreshing. And it's also not something that you can just pick up like a tool in your toolkit and do it right away. So I just wanted to say that up front as my caveat. And hopefully by the end of this, I'll get you excited about it. I work with Trisha and a lot of other folks through the University of Washington Alacrity Center that is focused on the alignment of human-centered design and implementation science. So if you are interested in how you could, get more resources and learn more about these methods, get connected to other people who are doing work in this space. We do have a particular focus on mental health treatment in underserved communities. So the equity focus is there, and we're trying to punch it up more and more. And that's why I asked Trisha to be a co-presenter with me. And I will say lots of other people from the center contributed content and slides and things like that to this presentation. So you probably would find our website really useful. It is undergoing a redesign. So if you look at it down the road, it might look different from this screenshot. But especially if you check under resources, if you want to get, publications, a lot of publications in this space. If you're looking for measures that you might be able to use, grant writing tips, things like that. There's a lot of resources on the website that you might find useful. Okay, so besides the big picture stuff that I already said, here's kind of the key takeaways that I hope that you will get by the end of the presentation today. The first is to just notice and think about design. So everything that we can use as humans are designed. So if you have ever been involved in, excuse me, the creation or implementation of any sort of intervention or other activity, you have made design decisions or been constrained by design decisions that the developer made, whether they were intentional about it or not. And learning to see how things are designed and to be thoughtful about how that process works can also help us to recognize when there might be biases or limitations in how things were designed and how we could improve them. The next thing I'll say is, I'll give you a lot of background and introduction to the field of human-centered design today. This is really quite a distinct field from implementation science. I would say they're quite complementary, but the foci and the strategies, the Venn diagram, I literally have a graphic later where I'll show you. There's a lot of overlap and a lot of things that don't overlap. So again, this isn't something that's just gonna seamlessly fit into what you're already doing if you're thinking about things from an implementation science lens. It probably would actually challenge your thinking in a lot of ways, but I think that's a good thing. So just think of them as complementary to each other. And then the third thing is to recognize some of the opportunities that we have to improve alignment between these two fields in ways that could enhance equity and to advance these shared goals that both of the fields have around maximizing benefits for all people who could receive an intervention, a product, a service, et cetera. So to start with the first point that I made about just recognizing design, you probably have all encountered things in your life that you wish were designed differently or that were better. There's so many examples, but I picked this one, and then it actually coincidentally happened in the rental car that I had this past weekend because I came to Miami early, that it gave me one of these messages, a really long message on the screen, basically telling you to be safe while you're driving. And if you think about the impact that it has on you as the user of the vehicle to get this message, it is doing exactly the opposite of what it's telling you to do, which is making you take your eyes off of the road for an extended period of time to read a long message. And then hopefully you're still alive at the end of reading that message. And this is kind of the annoying thing about becoming more aware and intentional of design is you'll start to notice design problems everywhere. And there's a period you'll go through where you get really, really annoyed. And then you'll realize humans are humans and we don't do things perfectly, and that's okay. But it does get really frustrating for a little while. And you really do see them everywhere. Even I was taking notes yesterday, and when Omar showed that video where there were subtitles, if you notice, they were actually competing at some points because there were the subtitles of the English, for people who have hearing impairments. And then there were subtitles of Spanish for people who don't speak Spanish. And sometimes they literally overlapped and you couldn't read both of them because they were competing with each other. So, and that's not at all to like criticize Omar. Again, it's just to point out that like these design problems are everywhere. And we can become attuned to look for them and think about how to treat them as opportunities and not just things that are annoying. So the alternative to good design is bad design. This is a really common quote that you'll hear in design spaces and conversation. So there's really no such thing as no design at all. So again, this is what I say is like, if you've ever created something, you have made design decisions, whether you were thinking about it as a design process and whether you had any formal training or reference point for what effective design looks like. So there's not really no design, there's just bad design. The caveat I would put on this, and this was a point that Trisha made to me, is sometimes the alternative is no design in the sense that like something was created that we wish had never been created in the first place. Like, as a queer person, I would say like conversion therapy, or people call it sexual orientation, gender identity change efforts. Like those are things where it's like, I do kind of think the alternative is no design, because we just wish that it had never existed in the first place. And this goes back to the de-implementation conversation from yesterday. But maybe you want to design something better to sort of meet whatever need is causing people to think that they need that particular design solution. But really, and anything that you create and that you're trying to put out in the world is going to have some design decisions in it. So if we want to think about this in an equitable way, this is a quote that really, I think, helps move the conversation past this. It's kind of just become a standard saying that alternative to good design is bad design, but to really think about, okay, that means that we have a responsibility when we are taking on the task of designing something to really think about how it fits into a world that has a lot of inequities already baked into the design of our structures and the systems that we're operating within, and how can we actually take on that responsibility to say, we're designers, we're pattern makers, whatever you want to call yourself. How can we actually make design decisions that would improve equity, would enhance inclusion, accessibility, whatever the goal is, depending on the context that you're working in. And then as long as we're doing quotes, this also, the conversation yesterday about how do we be really intentional. And I'm trying to find, Tyler said about, how do we not do implementation necessarily slowly, but just do it deliberately, do it with intention. And then Borsika thought, came up with the quote about moving at the speed of trust. I think that using human-centered design principles and really like the philosophy behind it, it can help you to do implementation more successfully, more deliberately, and in a more trustworthy way. Not inherently, but it creates a lot of opportunities for you to do that. So I'm curious, I've been pointing out that these design problems are everywhere. Raise your hand if any of these situations ever resonate with you, if you've sort of created something and you've thought about, well, I don't know if anybody who isn't in our team that created this could use it. Like maybe this isn't scalable. Maybe you've tried to get people to use it and you've gotten complaints about, we don't understand how to do this. It's too complicated. It takes too much time. It's too cumbersome. It doesn't work for our particular population. Have people encountered these problems before? Okay, I'm starting to see hands. Does anybody want to share an example? Like what's a situation where you've had people say basically, we can't use this or it's really hard to use it? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you want clinicians to do measurement-based care And the way that the measurement-based care system is designed, it's electronic. So there's a lot of technology requirements that are now built into completing that activity. And then there's barriers to people having access or capacity to use the technology. Yes, great example. And I think I'm glad you brought that up actually, because a lot of people, I think when they hear about design, their mind automatically goes to tech as a thing that you would design. But all of our psychosocial activities and interventions and implementation strategies, they're designed too. So sometimes technology is the answer and sometimes it isn't. And the goal of something like human-centered design is not to like digitize everything necessarily, because sometimes, like you're saying, it creates new barriers. And I imagine that there were, maybe good usability reasons that people wanted it to be technology-based in the first place. But now you're in a situation where it's created new barriers. Yeah, thank you. Great example. Yeah, one more.
Simple.
Yes.
Like, a mental health equity center, and the psychiatrist is like, the person comes up to us, to the community health workers, and they have psychosocial needs. Give them the mental health assessment first. And it's like, no, they didn't come to you with a mental health concern. Their concern was they don't have food or there's housing instability. So why are we doing this? The community is going to reject it, and we have totally like killed our reputation in the community that we're trying to gain trust in.
Right. And so there's a lot of fields and subfields within design, and service design is definitely one of them. And thinking about like, okay, what is my experience as a client coming in? What are all the touch points that we have to go through? I think we all experience this, just like trying to book a appointment with your own healthcare provider, that like it gets so complicated. There's so many steps. You go in and people want to talk about something other than what you came in because you wanted to talk about it. And it sounds like you're talking about clients who also, they have really pressing needs. Maybe they're in distress. And so how can you have the services be like responsive and quick, timely in terms of meeting the need that that person is going to need to keep going? And so I would say that service design, and that's a great example that it's not technology, right? But the design still matters. And how can you put structures in place where maybe everybody would follow that, and you don't have, a psychiatrist, for example, going rogue on you and saying, no, do it this way. Yeah, so great examples. And I'm going to try to, go as quickly as I can without being overwhelming, so that we could maybe do an activity at the end here. If we don't end up with time for it, it's in the slides, so you can do a lot of these sort of reflections and things like that on your own. But I say that just to say that like this is your time. And so if people have thoughts and questions throughout and you want to keep this more of a conversation, you don't have to hold your questions until the end. So feel free to jump in. The more time we spend discussing, the less time we'll have for the activity, but it's like whatever you would find the most useful today. So I will try to ask regularly if people have questions, but also feel free to interrupt me. Okay. So I think we've decided that this is pretty applicable. There was a study that came out of the UW Alacrity Center that identified common usability issues. And the citation at the bottom here, I would highly recommend checking this out. I think you will feel very validated by the usability issues that were identified in the study, because you've probably experienced them yourself in your own implementation activities. And this is a lot of what I was saying before, but just wanted to say that there is a taxonomy out there that you can reference and that you might find helpful for conceptualizing what is the usability issue that you're trying to solve. And I'm really starting here because I think it's important to understand what the problem is before you start thinking about, okay, now I'm going to bring in all these tools and do all these fun design activities and come up with solutions. You could spend a lot of time trying to solve something that turns out to really not be the fundamental usability issue, because maybe you haven't taken the time to really get that input from the people who are the users to understand what their concern is and conceptualize it. And having this type of taxonomy can help you sort of think through, okay, have we really differentiated whether this is like buy-in issue? For example, if you look at 6 and 7, I should have put them next to each other. why are the interventionists not using this? We did all this training with them. We tried to convince them that it was a great idea. Is it because they don't see the value in it, or is it because they don't trust us? So getting back to the trust conversation from yesterday, do you actually know, or are you just assuming that you know what the users think? Because differentiating between the two of those would actually be really difficult, right? And so you could spend a lot of time trying to come up with design solutions to convince people of the value, but the issue the whole time was that they didn't trust you. So it doesn't matter what you say until you can solve that problem. So I won't go through all of these again. I would check out that paper led by Sean Munson, and I'm going to come back to it later and talk about how you can solve these problems. But again, I'm trying to really diagnose the problem first. And I would say kind of what this comes down to, and I know that there's a lot of researchers in the room and we're all really interested in getting grant funding. The things that get us funded and published and make our solutions seem really innovative and exciting and different from what we've done before is really what you get on the left, is like these hyper bespoke, super intensive interventions, all sorts of implementation strategies, kitchen sink. We're going to make sure that these people have never been healthier, and we can get really big between group effect sizes in our clinical trial, and that's amazing. But are we actually designing for how this would work in the real world? Are we actually designing for the users that we want to generalize to, which are recipients and interventionists and other people involved who have all sorts of constraints and all sorts of other requirements and needs and desires beyond something that, you know, in a grant funded project or a publication we might prioritize. So I would really watch out for, you know, who are we designing for? And there are users of research, right? Funders and peer reviewers and things like that who are going to ask for things who don't benefit the users of your intervention or your implementation strategy at all, and might actually be at cross purposes with them. So we have to be really careful about how we get ourselves in these situations, and then we wonder why no one wants to use the things that we spent years and years and years creating and, in our mind, perfecting. So to start talking a little bit more about what human-centered design is as a field and how it can give us some solutions, there are lots of different terms and sort of overlapping fields that you would see here. User-centered design is certainly one that is like pretty close to synonymous with human-centered design. I won't define all of these. I will just say that like this is the same problem that we have in implementation science, right? Of like, okay, how is this different from like knowledge translation or scalability or quality improvement or all of these other fields? And basically, you know, researchers, we can make anything complicated, and there's a lot of different fields out there. But we really focus on human-centered design as sort of having this ethos of putting humans and like their full needs. So not just treating people with users as a single product, but thinking about them as full people. And why would they, out of all the things that they could do in their day, care about the thing that we're offering them and make it a priority in their life? And how is it going to meet needs for them? So that's the ethos from human-centered design and why we really like using that term. But you'll see all these other terms too. This is one example. Again, you'll find lots of, you know, frameworks and conceptual models in design, just like you find in implementation science. I like this one because it's nice and simple, and it has this really clear graphic of this being an iterative process. And I can't underscore enough how important that is if you're going to say, we are going to design things with the people who are ultimately going to use them. It can't be a one-way or one-time conversation. It needs to be ongoing. And you need to go back to people, often multiple times, and say, did we do what you asked us to do? Did the solution that we come up with actually improve your usability, your engagement, your motivation for this solution? Are we getting closer to actually solving the problem that you care about in your life? So it's this iterative process of understanding the people who are going to use your intervention or implementation strategy, developing and refining prototypes. when Borska was talking yesterday about how, sometimes for something like a logic model, the absolute best thing is the one that was drawn on the back of a cocktail napkin while you were having a free-flowing conversation. Like, don't be afraid to just prototype something in a really simple way and put it in front of people and say, hey, what do you think? Like, this definitely isn't the final solution, but just tell us if you think that we're on the right track or not. If you spend years and years developing something before you ask people for feedback, it's kind of like, they'll give you feedback and then you're like, oh, well, those are really great points, but also it's like way too late to change some of this stuff. So you're not keeping the people at the center of the design process if they come in late, or if they only come in at the beginning and then you're like, well, we know what they want because they told us that one time. So now we're just going to run with it for 2 years. You can kind of end up in the same problem. You really need to actually, in that final step, take your solution back to people, actually have them interact with it and try it and test it and see how it works for them. And that's going to give you more insight. It's going to give you ideas to continue prototyping and refining and go through these cycles to get closer and closer to a solution that's really going to work. And of course, over time, you can also be involving different people so that you're not over designing for a really small group of highly engaged people. You do want to then take it and say, well, let's try it with some new users who have never seen it before and see if they like it, or if they're like, oh no, that one group just like had some idiosyncratic things that they really wanted, but that doesn't make sense for us. So, we want to be careful. We want to stay humble about like, how well do we really understand what our users as a collective group want? So thinking about how this ties into equity, you can think about a lot of different ways that this increases sort of the input, the agency, the voice of the individuals and communities that we are doing this work ultimately to benefit their health and well-being, right? So it makes sense that they should have that input, and that we can really align with the needs and the settings of the people who are going to use the solutions that we're trying to create, to really have the usability reflect people's lived experiences and what it is actually like for them to, make decisions and, try to make changes on a day-to-day basis. What does that actually look like? And can really improve things like contextual fit and cultural responsiveness to actually see people test things out and say, well, here's where I ran into problems. Here's where it was weird for my clients. Here's where it felt really unnatural for me. Here's where it's created a problem for me. And sometimes people won't anticipate things until they actually try it out. But ultimately, again, about staying humble, it's this idea that the users are going to be in the best position to tell you what they need, and no amount of like academic credentials or reading or sort of hypothesizing about what you think people are going to need is a substitute for giving them the opportunity to actually try things and tell you in whatever way is sort of developmentally appropriate for them, tell you or show you whether it's working for them or not. But that doesn't mean that, oh, okay, as soon as I get a designer on my team and now we're doing human-centered design, that means that we're like magically going to get equitable outcomes. And that's just like inherently, same thing I was saying yesterday about like, it's not inherent in implementation science that you would have equity or community engagement. It's not inherent in human-centered design either. So anything, if we care about equity, we have to stay in that position of being thoughtful and reflective and critical of ourselves, right? Hold ourselves to a really high standard and look for all the ways that power structures and biases and assumptions and inequities can creep into the process. Because of course, you could talk to users and then come up with your own interpretation about what they're saying, or your own preference for how to resolve maybe disparate input from different groups of users. Different individuals tell you different things. Your own positionality as a researcher, you still have power as the designer to make the ultimate decision. And so how are you going to do that in a way that doesn't end up maybe marginalizing within the group that you're interacting with certain voices, certain perspectives that you just, they don't make sense to you. You find them inconvenient as the researcher. So you're just like, well, not everybody said it, so I guess we don't have to do that. And I'll talk later about some schools of design that are really really prioritize sort of thinking about inclusivity and power structures and things like that as part of the process. But again, don't assume that it's inherent, and like vet your collaborators, vet your own process throughout to make sure that you really are keeping equity at the center of it. But if you go into it with that mindset, then these methods really can help. Usability is a core issue. We've been talking about it, but I wanted to provide a definition. I will say it's hard, and I asked Sean Munson, who I mentioned earlier, about this, and his response was, well, you know, like even separate from human-centered design, within design, usability is like its own field. Like there's people who that's their entire scholarship is like, how do we define usability? How do we measure feasibility? So it's not a simple concept, but it's really core to the idea of, well, what does it mean to make things more usable for the people that we're designing around during the human-centered design process? So this is kind of the best definition that we can find. It's a little tautological, right? It's like, how well can people use it? But it's also kind of that thing of like, again, you as the researcher, even though you're going to think about usability, you're going to come up with your own metrics for how you're measuring and defining usability. Ultimately, what it comes down to is like, your users know it when they see it, and they're going to tell you what their experience has been. And that's the most important thing. And not, oh, we have this like beautiful, parsimonious, amazing definition of usability. So again, this is what I mean when I say like, you might feel overwhelmed if you were planning to leave today saying like, I know exactly what usability is and I can go measure it in my project tomorrow. Like you're really going to have to think about this and do some reading. And I will say too, that there are other metrics that are important in design besides usability. I would just say it's the absolute most core one, but especially if you want to think about equity, you would probably want to look at other metrics like contextual responsiveness, for example. But I didn't want to give a whole laundry list and be overwhelming. I would just say like, if you're new to this, start with usability, spend some time wrapping your head around what does that really mean and what would that look like for the intervention or the implementation strategy that I'm developing that I really care about. What would it look like for that to be usable? And what would my users say to me or show me behaviorally that would tell me that it's usable? And it should kind of fit back to this definition. But I fully acknowledge that the definition on its own is probably not 100% satisfactory. And again, talk to designers because they will really help you think through what usability means in practical terms for what you're trying to do. In terms of how this relates to implementation. Oh, yes, question, go ahead. I am going to get to that in just a couple of slides, so I promise I'm not trying to put you off. Now everyone's like, oh, don't ask questions, he was lying. No, but like really, we're going to get to that very soon. And I will say you don't have to, and I'm sure Bosca would agree with me that like there's no one size fits all answer to what you would do for framework, but I will show you an example of a framework for implementation specifically that incorporates human-centered design. So you might find that to be a really parsimonious solution. And if not, I think it's also totally fine to take something like the framework that I showed before and just kind of overlay that or align it with some other implementation framework that makes more sense for you instead of, oh, we're going to adopt a new one. Okay, so we're heading there because I wanted to start talking about how this fits with implementation science, right? So your question was very timely. We think of these questions around usability as really falling pretty early. And I say this is a paper that Aaron Lyon led. So I'm trying to, again, give credit for where these slides came from, where if you think about how you sort of would sequence your implementation outcomes, there's some of them that really come first, like before people would even change their behavior, right? It's just like, what do they think about the thing that you're asking them to do? Do they think that it's acceptable, appropriate, and feasible? And then you'll see behavior change follow after those perceptual outcomes. And so Aaron and Eric Bruns have this paper where they positioned usability as sort of a fundamental outcome that would influence people's perceptions of things like acceptability, appropriateness, and feasibility. It's sort of like your starting place for, okay, I'm looking at this thing, I haven't seen it before, I'm trying to decide if I'm going to do it or not, I'm trying to decide if this is a good idea or not. Kind of everything's going to tie back to, okay, is it usable or not? And from there, you might get into more of these nuances where you're actually talking about, well, what would it look like for me to use it? And that's where you might start hearing about acceptability, appropriateness, and feasibility. Another point here, just to think about within the implementation process, usability is going to become increasingly important the more you're trying to scale up. So if you have this really bespoke solution that's going to be implemented in really specific settings with people who have really specific expertise, they're highly motivated, you have a lot of interaction with them, it's maybe okay that your solution is not super usable because you have people who are going to make it work and can sort of figure it out regardless of the usability and still make it happen. But if you're talking about something where your goal is to really take this to scale, to see it used widely, you know, to say, you know, well, I myself am not a scalable solution. So what does it look like for other people to deliver this, for other people to do the training, for other people to do the technical assistance? Is that possible? Or is it going to be like everything comes back to people asking Alex, well, what am I supposed to do here? Which is definitely not my goal in anything that I do. But just to point out that like I'm working much more on the high scalability end. And so you might just want to think about like, what is the minimum level of usability that is important for your setting? Because it's not that the answer is always, we need to maximize and get 100% usability. So this is the Venn diagram that I promised earlier. I will say this is like a really oversimplified comparison of HCD and implementation science. If you think that this is interesting and you want a more detailed description, the citation here, we have a paper that we published it's basically the proposal for a workshop for the Computer Human Interaction CHI conference. In HCD, there's a lot more emphasis on conference papers as opposed to papers that you submit like separately to a journal. So this is basically like the equivalent of an implementation science publication, but it might look a little weird when you look at it. But we do have a really detailed comparison of the two fields because the goal of the workshop was to bring people together from both fields and for them to have conversations about how we could better collaborate and align with people from both backgrounds. So there's a lot of emphasis, if you look on the left side here in HCD, for innovating to meet the needs of the people who you are working with. So a lot of emphasis on, you know, the particular context, particular well-defined user groups. There's not sort of the same type of emphasis that we would have in implementation science about like, we have this thing that has been clearly defined operationally and rigorously tested. And if you're going to use it in another setting, you need to like have this emphasis on fidelity to that. And, you know, of course, there's pros and cons to both of these approaches. So I'm not saying that one is better than the other. And the other thing is that we tend to think more, we have more multi-level models in terms of conceptualizing things like barriers and facilitators and where our strategies would target in implementation science. And that is often less the case in human-centered design. I will point out that, you know, some things like service design, which I mentioned earlier, they are thinking more about systems and structures. So everything I'm saying here is sort of an oversimplification. Certainly in implementation science, there's been a lot more emphasis on the science and practice of adaptations. So again, the rigid emphasis on fidelity seems to be changing on our side. But if you look in the middle, really the things that we have in common that we can collaborate on is how do we help people identify, adopt innovations that it would make sense for them to adopt? How do we offer things that people are going to want to use that will address real world problems and work in complex systems where there's multiple interested parties, and we need to help people sort of navigate these things and make decisions that are ultimately going to improve health and well-being. These are things that we have in common. And so if you're approaching someone with a design background and you want to sort of get them interested in what you're doing and have a conversation about how they might contribute and collaborate, those might be useful starting points for that conversation, is asking them, well, what is the type of work that they do along these sorts of lines, and how does that fit with what you're trying to do? Okay, so this is back to your question. And so I'll see if you have any follow-up questions after I talk through, but this is the Discover, Design, Build, and Test, or DDBT framework. This is one of the main products that came out of the first cycle of the Alacrity Center. We were renewed, so we're in the second cycle now. And I was not part of the core team in the first cycle, so I can't take any credit for this framework. But we use it quite a lot. All of the projects that are part of the center use it. All of our measurement is sort of tied to which phases we're using it. And really what this is it's taking those same steps that I talked through earlier, where you saw the iterative cycle, and it's helping think through how you would apply this in an implementation science context with, in particular, redesign of interventions and implementation strategies to maximize usability. So often in implementation science, we have some sort of thing that's already been developed and maybe undergone some sort of efficacy or effectiveness testing already. You could follow this process and create something brand new in implementation science, but because most of us are more focused on implementation than intervention, not necessarily in this room, but I'm just saying us, like people like me who are implementation scientists, first and foremost, we're not really like creating the evidence-based practices to be implemented. So we're often presented with something where it's like, well, if you want people to use this, we might want to tweak it, we might want to refine it, we might want to get it there and do some redesign. And so this will help guide through those steps of how you would do it. And there is this test phase at the end. So there's this idea of, it is really important to know whether our redesigned solution is working or not. And this is where you might bring in another implementation framework to really think about things like, what kind of outcomes are we wanting to evaluate? What types of contextual factors and influences are we going to evaluate? Because in the test phase, what you're often going to see is a much larger study. It might be a pilot, it might be a fully powered comparative trial or something like that. But you're going to have to really think about, okay, what do we want to do to evaluate this at scale? And you could continue to do some tweaking in the test phase, but really the goal at that point is more about evaluation. And if you identified a key issue, this is not meant to be completely linear. So the cycle is clearest in the middle with design and build, where you're definitely going to go through that multiple times. But you could get into the test phase and then be like, I think we actually need to go back and do more design and build, or maybe even more discovery, because like now that we've gotten in the field at a bigger scale, we've really identified some issues that we missed before. So that can happen, but the idea is that the test phase would be the most sort of summative evaluation that you would do after a lot of formative work in the earlier phases. So I want to come back and see if this is answering your question about frameworks. Excellent. Yeah, Borska. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you could absolutely do that. You could maybe look at implementation outcomes at every stage. Your indicators in the earlier phases might be different just because the time scale is often a lot faster. So, some of our implementation outcomes, it could take a little while to see whether you're moving the needle or not. So you might need something that's more like a preliminary indicator, but you could still be thinking about reach and other implementation outcomes from the beginning. You could also do things like, I just submitted a proposal where we overlaid this with EPIS, and we talked about how we want to make sure that we are coming up with design solutions that will help guide through every phase of implementation. So are we doing this in a way that will encourage people when they're exploring to actually adopt the thing in the first place, all the way through from the beginning being able to say, this is how it'll be sustainable for you. So yes, you can overlay this again with any other implementation framework. You can see the design is really the focus here. So I wouldn't really even call this an IS framework. It's sort of an HCD framework that is aligned with implementation science in a way that most other HCD frameworks that you look at would not be. Great. Okay, so I forgot about my animations, so we'll just keep going. I made this point already, so I'm just going to go really quick here to say again that you can target lots of different things. So certainly digital technology is one, and this is the point I made earlier. But you can also design or redesign psychosocial interventions and implementation strategies, right? And again, anything that you do is designed. So that includes your implementation strategy. And if you think about what it means to really like define and describe what you're doing in implementation, just saying, oh, we're going to do training. There's so many design decisions you're going to make in training in terms of like how didactic versus interactive is it? What are the characteristics of the trainer? What are the, requirements and information that is provided ahead of time to trainees so that they know what to expect going in and you can get the right people in the room. Is it virtual or is it in person? There's so many design decisions in something as simple as saying, oh, we're going to train people in how to do our intervention. So all of those apply. If you want to get a flavor of the different design activities that you could do, because it's not just sit down and have a conversation with your users, right? There's a lot of different ways that you can interact with people to get information from them. My introduction to working with Sean and Aaron, we've been collaborating now for almost a decade, and the first thing we did was publish this glossary of user-centered design. I hadn't caught on to human-centered design yet, so I was still calling it UCD. But we wrote this as a glossary for people to understand and have some working definitions of all of the different strategies that you could use. So these are more sort of discrete design focused tasks that you could do with people. And it goes all the way from just learning more about your users to actually designing things together and co-creating what those solutions could look like. How does this animation work? This is not my slide. So yeah, you can see that variety here, just watching people do the tasks that you're trying to help them do better out in the field would be something like field observations. And you could just already learn, well, what are the issues that they're running into? What's making it hard for them to do this job? And is our solution responsive to that? Or is it just giving them something different to do? And that like core problem that they're encountering still remains the entire time. And of course, things like interviews and focus groups can be useful for learning about people. So, let them tell you what they think. And then you can actually sit down with people and have a structure where you bring them in and say, well, what do you think it would look like? And like give people permission to be designers, give them permission to give you something that's a really low fidelity prototype and be like, well, let's just sketch it out. Or you just narrate out loud and maybe you're doing it as a group, riff off of each other, say what you would want it to look like. And I'll just like sketch it up here on the whiteboard. And yeah, it's going to look really silly and basic, but we'll all get an idea of what we think the ideal solution would look like. And, doing that in an iterative way, bringing it back multiple times and saying, okay, were we able to realize the thing that you all came up with in the last session? Like now we tried to make it look a little pretty and polished and like something you could actually use. Try it out. What do you think? We had a lot more examples. So if you look at that glossary paper, hopefully it'll give you, again, some nice working definitions and some vocabulary that you could talk through with the designer and sort of say, at what point in the process would we maybe want to do these different activities with different groups to help get us to an effective design solution. Just to drive that point home about alignment, the reason that we created that glossary was to do this concept mapping study where it's like a card sort task done virtually. So people took implementation strategies from the Powell et al. Eric compilation and then the HCD strategies from our list. And these were experts from both fields, and they sorted them into groups. And these are the groups that they came up with. And you can see from the color coding that there were a lot of implementation strategy only clusters on the top. There were a couple of HCD only strategy clusters on the bottom. And then in the middle, you can see 3 that had strategies from both. But even then, it was often, the cluster is really skewed towards one or the other. And so this is where we really came to that conversation about like, we need to talk about aligning these fields. There's a protocol paper from this project. And if you look that up, the title of it is about integrating, because we were really maybe overly ambitious about saying like, oh, we're going to find all of these points of overlap and we can talk about how the 2 fields could really become a lot more integrated with each other. And after seeing this results, it was sort of like, no, that's not the conversation. It's really what I said before about them being complementary. And I do still think that these mixed clusters are really interesting because, for example, you have ideas that are presented in one field in maybe a really thin way. And then you look at the other field and they give you lots more strategies and ideas for how to do it. So there's some ERIC strategies that talk about how like you should engage users and how you should be having these productive conversations and things like that. But if you look at that cluster 10 code design solutions, there's way more of these blue diamonds, which are the HCD strategies. So it's like, this field is actually going to tell you how to get it done. The ERIC strategies kind of just tell you that it's a good idea, but they don't really give you like concrete techniques that you could use. So this just, I hope, gives a little bit more insight in why we talk about these fields being complementary and why you need to align them and why you shouldn't underestimate how much time it would take to like really build a strong collaborative relationship with designers, but also how much it will enrich your experience because it's just such a different way of working towards a common goal. So I had the 10-minute warning. So I kind of have a decision point to make now. We've had some good discussion already, and I'm just curious to take the temperature in the room if people would rather that I go more quickly so that we could do a little bit of practice and like work some examples together, or if you would rather that we just keep this, conversational and I'll keep going through the slides and people can keep asking questions. And, I can just like orient you to the activity at the end, but you could take a spin at it on your own. Does anybody feel really strongly that like, oh, I really want to do the activity right now? Okay, I see you. If we don't have time to get to it, then I'm here all week, so maybe we could like do a consultation and do it together. So either way, we will do it. Maybe today if people don't have a lot of questions, but I don't want to rush this part if people aren't feeling like, oh, we have to get to the activity. So, okay, I've been talking a lot about sort of like, how do we think about this and how do we conceptualize the problems and what would the approach look like? So you're probably still wondering, well, like, what would it look like for me to actually do this? And how can I get to equity as part of that? So it is really important to think about who it is that you're designing for. And so here's another quote for you. If you're designing for everyone, you're designing for no one. I will talk about the concept of universal design and sort of like every axiom is going to have an exception, right? So sometimes you really could design for everyone, but more often than not, if you're designing for everyone, you're really designing for the people who have the most power and privilege, I would say. So we need to be really thoughtful about this. Oh, yes.
I've seen this both in reviews and also struggled with it myself in projects of doing user-centered design or HCD for strategy selection and getting sort of the potential criticism that you're only figuring out a local solution.
Mm-hmm.
And also you have large multi-site cluster randomized trial, like making sure that the strategies being used are basically similar across all rigor purposes and everything else. Do you have any like thoughts about how to sort of deal with that tension, I guess, between like what reviewers expect is like everyone gets a similar thing and UCD principles of this, designing for everyone, designing for no one?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my first thought would be even in implementation science, we talk a lot about the importance of context, tailoring to context, local adaptation, tailored selection of implementation strategies. So to me, everyone gets the same thing is more about sort of like core functions and having a menu of options to meet those functions. I know that it's hard to lay out all of those options and how you would pick which one in a way that could be convincing to reviewers. But to me, that is a much more realistic thing to offer as a scalable solution instead of we're going to come up with something that's completely generalizable and works for everyone. And so if that's what the reviewer is asking for, I would want to push back on their core assumption and say that's not even a core assumption of implementation science, let alone when we bring in HCD. Yes.
I recently got the opportunity to scale and expand regionally a clinical treatment pathway that I designed. And so now that I'm in different hospitals, the way I look at it is I have a base code.
Mm-hmm.
Like everybody gets the same standard of care,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I need to contextually, culturally design.
Absolutely.
Right, with the original base code, right? And so the base code can be a starting point, but then you just need to contextually design to each site that you extend to. And it's still like no one's getting a different standard of care, but there's just nuance.
Yes. Yeah. And I know that this is scary to say because we want our implementation process to be as low burden as possible, but anything you can build in to help guide that type of contextual tailoring is going to be really helpful, right? And thinking about, well, what does that look like? Because not every system that you work in is going to have a designer available who could help do that. But maybe you can set it up in a way where you don't need that design credibility anymore. Or maybe that's part of the technical assistance you offer is you actually have designers who are available, who could work with people broadly. But I'm always trying to navigate that tension because I also do a lot of research on cost. And so I'm always very sensitive to things that we're going to do that would increase the cost and the burden of implementing. But if the goal is effectiveness, right, like more cost effective doesn't necessarily mean cheaper. It means we need to be able to make the investment to actually get maximal outcomes. And it sounds like that's what you're doing. And like that's the balance that you're trying to strike. So tell me if I'm putting words in your mouth, but that's what I was hearing you say.
No, that's exactly right. And we just literally had this conversation a couple of days ago because I am the lead scientist on the project, and I obviously have a per hour rate, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the hospital that I'm working in now requested 8 trainings
Yeah.
in a month, and the county was like, well, should we invest? Like, does this inform our evidence for when we move to the next hospital? Do we take a chance on providing so many costly trainings?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And does that, let's see, right? So there's always that tension between everything has a cost associated to it. Is this really necessary? But we're going out on a limb and seeing if this actually does help, and then that will become a part of the implementation at the next site.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's giving me good examples. I see your hand, so I'll come to you, but I just want to put this out there so I remember to come back to it later. When we talk about defining who your different user groups are, you can have secondary users who maybe don't directly interact with your strategy or your intervention, but they are still important and they maybe have different usability considerations. And so for you, it's like these decision makers at the county who decide whether to pay for the training or not. For them, usability is like, can we afford it? Does it fit in our budget? So they have really different constraints and you might need to provide tailored information to them to show like, oh, it actually, we get the bang for our buck doing this, right? So they're still a user, but they have like very different needs and maybe need their own strategy to engage them. Okay, I saw your hand.
Because I think if you're designing for everyone, you're designing for no one. And part of what equitable implementation science is and design is to say, how are people who are not currently getting what they need, how are they going to get it? And designing something that can overcome political and social barriers like the video we saw yesterday where somebody had to travel out of state in order
Right.
to get medications,
Right.
I'm thinking about the plancheatpills.org folks who have done direct-to-consumer abortion pills through the mail, and how that's been a tremendous advancement in the design of their website, and everything is great, but at the end you still have to pay $150.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted, I'm a clinician, so I'm learning a lot here, and just thinking about the design element, how do you take into account the political and social barriers, and linguistic and other barriers that Omar brought up yesterday in your design, seems like a way.
Yeah, I want to make sure that I have time to get to those different schools of design that would help bring in, you know, the perspective that you're talking about in terms of analyzing things like inclusivity and power structures and things like that. How much, let me do a time check. How much time do I have before the break? 15 minutes. Okay. So let me make sure that I at least covered the two things that are relevant to your comments. And I might go a little faster in some of the other stuff. And then we can see what other questions people have. But we should be able to touch on both of those. Okay, so I will point this out really quickly because it's not from design, it's from implementation science. But if you just want something that could help guide you through doing reflective assessment on the usability of an implementation strategy that you have developed, it really talks about equity, but I see a lot of overlap in terms of thinking about usability as well, which is why I included it here. It's called Aspire: Adapting Strategies to Promote Implementation Reach and Equity. Part of the activity slides at the end has all of the Aspire questions, so you could actually fill that out yourself and ask yourself, you know, how well have we considered equity in an implementation strategy that we've been designing? So that's all I'll say about that here. But, you know, if you look at the slides, it does point out some points of overlap with the different phases of DDBT. So again, it's not explicitly about design, but I think it's really relevant. Oh, I'm really excited to do this. This is something that Aaron Lyon always does, and I've never got to do it before. So we've been talking a lot about users. How do we understand their perspective? How do they understand what we need? It is really, really easy to put your own perspective and life experience into what you think the users want. So I really want you to remember this. So I need everybody to say this with me. The user is not like me. So let's all say it together. The user is not like me. Even if they're from the same background as you, you know, you have all these points in common. If you can do human-centered design in a way that really lets that person share their perspective and experiences with you, you're going to find some points where you and them differ. So we can't ever substitute our own thought experiment for what users actually need and want. And so we actually have to have a working definition, and this is the point I wanted to come back to, of who our users are before we can start talking about, is this usable for them? And it's very easy to underestimate the diversity of needs and experiences of the people that you're trying to design for. And our usual bias when we don't have information is to make assumptions that are based on our own experience. And so we have to be really careful to guard against that. Here are some best practices for usability testing. Again, this is part of the activity at the end. So if you want some practice thinking about how you would apply these, they are listed out in the section that is sort of encouraging you to identify your users and think about how you would engage them and follow all of these best practices. So things like, how can we try to make our test of usability something that actually feels realistic and like how they would use this in real life, as opposed to a really artificial lab setting. So for example, if the user testing requires you to sit down for 10 minutes and explain the task to the person before they get started, is that a real world condition? Like, are you going to be there in the clinic with them or in the school with them or wherever you are every time they use it, spending 10 minutes explaining to them? I don't think either one of you wants that. So try to test it in a way where you're just like, well, I just want you to try it and see how it goes. And like, tell me which parts worked well and which parts were unclear or you felt stuck on. Focus groups are not usability testing. I say that because we have tools in our toolkit, often as implementation or health researchers, that we would default towards things like interviews and focus groups. They're really useful ways to learn about people's experiences, but you have to have people actually use at least a prototype of the thing that you're doing before you can say that they're testing it. So sitting around and sort of speculating, people aren't even that good about saying what they themselves need. Like, they're not going to anticipate everything that they come up with when they actually sit down and interact with your intervention or your implementation strategy. And I will just point out really quickly here that there are a lot of different ways that you could do usability evaluation. There's not really a gold standard here. There's going to be pros and cons to everything. It's going to give you different information and different perspectives. So if this is something you're curious about doing, I would say check out the UAC website, because there's a lot of guidance on there for different methods and measures that you could use to get at usability. So this is the other piece that I wanted to make sure that I got to really think about having inclusivity and equity be part of your design process. And again, emphasizing this point that it's not inherent. Everyone who you meet who like has credentials as a human-centered designer is not necessarily going to be experienced with this sort of orientation to design. So it's things that you might want to look for. And I'll start with the most basic distinction of if you're doing inclusive design versus universal design. So a design solution that is going to try to understand and account for diversity, at that point, you're really in the realm of inclusive design, as opposed to trying to design for everyone or trying to design for the average person, which we would call universal design. There's a lot of literature, I would say, that sort of uses universal design as a foil and says, like, you know, it's the baseline, it's the thing that people do because they're not being intentional, kind of in a way to say like, oh, it's always bad. I would say that there are cases, like I mentioned earlier, where universal design makes sense. An example of this is like in curbs on sidewalks, because, you know, curbs on the side of roads, like that's really there for cars. It's not there for people. So having curb cuts at crosswalks where you don't have to step down from the curb, that is really helpful for people who are using a wheelchair, for example. But it's also helpful if, you know, you have any other kind of mobility issue, you're dragging a suitcase. There's all sorts of reasons that it's just helpful to not have to step off of a curb. Sometimes you can be a perfectly healthy person like me who just is not paying attention to where you're going and steps off a curb and like totally mess up your hip unintentionally. So yeah, you know, that is an example of something where it's sort of like we can design it in a way where you could say, oh, we're doing this because everybody benefits. But we just want to point out that, like, if every road in your design process leads back to, oh, well, we can do this in a way where it just works for everybody, like, I would really question yourself to say, like, is every design problem that you're encountering really something that can be solved with a universal solution? Probably not. And you're probably not getting enough input from marginalized groups if all roads are leading you back to universal design. So there can be a time and place for it, but at a minimum, a good starting place would be take an inclusive design approach, and really in your assessment of users and their needs, try to get a good understanding of the diversity of needs and experiences and wants and desires from those groups. If you want to push this farther, equity-centered design and the related field of design justice are really going to push you to start thinking about power structures. And so I thought about this with the question earlier about, okay, some of your design constraints when you're trying to come up with a solution are going to be things out of your control, like, well, you have to pay $150 for this because that is a copay that was set by the insurance provider, and they are not a partner in this process, so we have zero way to influence them to change that fee. So now we're going to have to come up with a design solution that works around that constraint. And that could be things like, you know, when we're guiding clients through the process of ordering these pills, we also have a safeguard in place to check if they know that they're going to have to pay $150. Can they afford it? And if they can't, linking them to some sort of support that could offset or cover that fee. And those things can feel frustrating, right? Because it's like, oh, I'm like adding extra things to work around this constraint in the system. But we really have to think about, where do we have leverage? Where do we have power? And where can we use that to create solutions that are going to lift up and bring along people who otherwise would get left behind? Because in our design process, we weren't being inclusive, and we didn't think about the fact that people would have to pay this fee. We were just thinking about how to get the pills to them. We were too focused on the intervention being the pill and not the entire system that delivers that pill to a person. So is that kind of responding to what you were raising earlier? Great, great. Okay. I know I'm going through this really fast. Obviously, I had a lot to say about this, and I'm not going to be able to cover it all. So, but I will be around up until Friday morning. So happy to continue these conversations with people. I just wanted to make good on my promise that in the same paper that Sean Munson led, they talk about these proposed heuristics for addressing your usability issues. Heuristics are not a full design solution. So if you look at this, it's going to feel very in the realm of universal design. But the idea is this could give you a good starting point for having an informed conversation when you go to users. Like, you don't necessarily want to go in with a complete blank slate and just be like, oh, well, we have no idea how you would even solve this, because you're just going to overwhelm people. But instead say, here are the kind of problems that we're seeing and solutions that we're thinking about. Help us conceptualize it. Tell us if you agree. We were thinking that this might help because it requires minimal infrastructure, for example. That's one of the heuristics in there. But to bring in the equity and the justice pieces and things like that, you're going to have much more in-depth, process, and really think about it as sharing power and responsibility for the design process, right? Not giving up your responsibility as the researcher to guide the process, but saying, ultimately these design solutions, we want them to come from the community. And so this can be a way to have an informed conversation, but the heuristics aren't going to tell you everything that you need to know. You need a level of engagement and, support and reimbursement, if we're thinking about this from an equity perspective, for the people who are participating in the process and giving you their time and insights, to make sure that that is a productive conversation, and to make sure that they feel like equitable partners, and not that you're just like, as a researcher there, discovering, quote unquote, what they've been telling people for years, like, oh, final questions. And the rest of the slides are the design activity that I already mentioned, and it's the same pieces that we already talked about, but just encouraging, it gives you a structure where you could fill it out and start thinking about how this might apply to your own work. And it's much more about the conceptualizing and maybe giving you some ideas for how you might bring people in, or build these skills yourself. I should say too, I've seen people, for example, use a training award like a K to develop these skills. Aaron is a clinical psychologist like me, but he did like a certification through the Human-Centered Design Department to get some of these skills. So like you could learn it too, like not tomorrow, but you could also do it yourself if you want to make that investment in your training. So just all that to say that hopefully I've set you up to keep thinking about those things and reflecting on those things. Any other thoughts or questions? Yes, and then you next.
Just what the landscape is of using human-centered design intentionally and systematically in implementing the research protocols for implementation science?
Oh, that's a really good question. I don't know the answer specifically. For anyone who didn't hear the question, it was about using this to implement research protocols. I think we could do a lot of self-reflection on how to make our research processes user-friendly too. Like you're making design decisions about things like, surveys and focus groups and other sorts of research activities as well. So you could really apply it to anything. That's kind of the beauty of these principles. They apply to pretty much everything in your life. I do know that there's some research going on right now a student at UNC is doing this for her dissertation, where she's looking at use of human-centered design and related fields in NIH-funded studies. And that has increased a lot. I don't know to what extent people have said that they would use it for their research activities. I think people probably are mostly talking about how they would use it for intervention and implementation. But what she's finding is that it's exploded a lot in popularity. Again, this is similar to implementation science, but is maybe being applied in kind of like a thin way in a lot of cases, like not necessarily a lot of understanding, which is why I've tried to underscore so much today, like how much of a shift it is to really do this work well. But it definitely seems like there's a really strong and fast growing interest in applying this, certainly in health, if not in other fields. Yes.
Yeah. I was thinking as you were presenting on the different methods and strategies in human-centered design, and I'm thinking through how can something like discrete choice experiments or conjoint analysis fit into human-centered design or implementation science? As someone, I tend to be more quantitative heavy.
Yeah.
And so this feels very qualitative in nature. I could be mistaken, but based on how it was presented. And so how would something like that, where you're looking at utility and how you're packaging certain interventions together or strategies together based on user input, how discrete choice experiment kind of fits into this landscape that you're working in?
I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's totally my bad if I conveyed this as something that was more qualitative. There are definitely quantitative metrics that you can use for usability. Some of them are self-report measures. There's a system usability scale that has been around for a really long time. And Aaron and Sean have adapted that for an intervention and implementation strategy usability scale versions. So you can just ask people how usable they think things are and have them rate them. A lot of websites actually do discrete, not really discrete choice experiments, but they'll do systematic user testing where if multiple of us log on to the same website, we will see different things. And they're actually tracking things like how much time do you spend on the site? How much time does it take you to click on different things? How likely are you to complete XYZ tasks? So those are all things that you can quantify too. Sometimes, at least in the settings that I work in, we don't have like the IFT infrastructure to track things like that kind of inherently in the background, but you certainly could look at it. And I would think for discrete choice testing, I don't know enough about it to say exactly where it would fit in, but I would say you could think about how to bring any method to bear that would make sense through the DDBT phases that I was talking about. Like, there's nothing about this process that says you have to pick things off of the menu of human-centered design strategies. There might be other things that are complementary and would still tell you a lot about usability, especially if you paired it with something like, okay, we're going to have people do these usability ratings as part of it. So yeah, you absolutely can look at things in a quantitative way, and often in a mixed methods way, right, where you have qualitative pieces as well. Yes. And then okay.
The training. Yeah. That's
Absolutely. Yeah, well, and that's a great point too, is like I was talking about quantitative ways that you could measure usability, but you might have other quantitative metrics that you think are really important too. Like, yeah, it's great to say that it's usable, but also, is it getting us the implementation outcomes that we want? Is it getting us the service outcomes that we want? And depending on the phase that you're in, again, how you conceptualize that might be different. But yeah, you'll almost certainly want to look at other outcomes too, and not just design specific outcomes. So great point. Bern?
Yeah, I was just, really reflecting on human-centered design. This is my first kind of introduction to it. And it had me thinking back to the wonderful class that I love to hate. Epistemology. So,
Yes.
restricted epistemic perspective, we're looking at more of the critical epistemologies, right? And so most of us, or we may or may not be, right, grounded in our lens to look at standpoint epistemology or Black feminist thought
Mhm.
or feminism, right, or third wave feminism. So this really, for me in my work, it's taken me back to how I'm even grounding myself as a researcher, right? So if I am looking to infuse equity into human-centered design or equity into community, not just community engaged, but community participatory, CPPR,
Yes.
right? All of this kind of goes, it's all really kind of intertwined if we're looking at this from an equity / social justice oriented lens.
Yes, I completely agree. And I think that that's the beauty and what I love of transdisciplinary research is bringing people together who have different philosophies of science, different epistemologies, different perspectives. Even people in the community, if they're not trained as scientists, they still have their inherent epistemology about, well, this is how I think about things, this is how I know things, this is how I make decisions. So we're all bringing that together. And I do think implementation science does a good job of encouraging people to like find common ground and collaborate and see things from different perspectives. I've never asked anyone in design explicitly about like how they think about philosophy of science. So I'm going to bring that question back. But I totally agree with you that there's so much value in expanding your worldview around like just how do we understand the world? How do we understand, how do we decide when we know something enough to act on it? And I've really appreciated the designers in my life, people like Sean and Trisha, who have really like challenged the way I think about that. It's really nice. It's really refreshing. And of course, when you talk with users out in the community, they'll do that to you too, right? They'll tell you what they think and how they know what they know. And we should be open to all of that because it's all valuable and we can put it together. So I think I'm probably at time. Yes. So that's a great note to end on. Thank you all so much. And I just want, before I go, to acknowledge one more time, those are all the slides that you can check out on your own. All the great people here. So I got pictures of Trisha, Aaron, and Sean. And I want to acknowledge Nicole Sams, who's another student who also helped along with Trisha and really infusing a lot of the equity pieces into this presentation. So great group of people, appreciate their contribution, even though we ended up with way too much content. So thanks everybody for bearing with.
Thank you so much. So we have a quick 10-minute break. If we can be back in the room by 10:40, that would be great. And also since we didn't have everybody's IDs, we didn't do a check-in today, but there's a sign-in sheet in the back of the room on that counter. If you can just check your name off, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much. So 10:40, we'll be back.